Falcha, welcome back to Irish Granny Tarot. This is part 3 of our book by Leslie Kean, Surviving Death. And we're starting chapter 13 when she's talking to an Irish psychic called An Almost Perfect Reading. Her name is Sandra O'Hara from my hometown, Belfast, and they did it on Skype. Leslie used a fake name, and a friend did the contacting to make the arrangements for the appointment. Laura had told her that our loved ones can read our thoughts. They're with us and they can receive mental messages from us. And so Leslie decided to test this with Sandra, this second psychic. So what have I got here? So for about a week prior to my second reading, I earnestly sent the following thoughts to both Bud and my brother. Will you please come through again with Sandra, and will you each say something to Sandra that is exactly the same as what you said to Laura? If you were really there with Laura, then come back and prove it is really you by repeating something you said before, and then I will know. So Sandra immediately saw 2 men and a woman and said it was it her mother? And Leslie thought, oh dear, this is not good. My mother's not dead. And a guy called William. So what happened, I'm going to read this list that came from Sandra. And part of it is what Sandra said and then Leslie's explanation. So he died of cancer, this man. Sandra doesn't know who she's talking about to Leslie. He died of cancer. That's what killed Bud. He had one other important female in his life. He had a daughter. I and another woman important to him were with him when he died. Leslie and the daughter. The word April is in reference to something significant. The daughter's mother's name is April. He was an artist. I see paintings and a paintbrush in his hand. He was an established painter whose work was in the collection of major museums. Work had brought them together. They had a similar passion, and that's the UFO thing. The star people, this connects you. Yikes. Bud's focus was on people who claimed to have had encounters with extraterrestrial beings, star people, and the work connected us. Then Sandra said, from the Spielberg movie E.T., the scene where E.T. points to the boy and says, Elliot, Elliot. This is what Sandra says out loud. Leslie says, Bud dealt with claims of people contacting E.T. beings in his work, and here was an E.T. being. Even more significant was the Elliot. This was Bud's actual first name, spelled the same as the kid in the movie. He died shortly after a milestone birthday, one ending with a 0, 2 months after his 80th birthday. He was a New Yorker, yes. There was a problem with property after he died, and he's unhappy about that. And there was problems with the co-owner of his townhouse. You, Leslie, are behind the camera and in front of it related to work. And that's the documentary and helping with it. I see a hammer and a chisel. He's making something. Bud did sculpturing as well as painting. He had more than one lady and was popular. It was more than flirtatious. He was married 3 times and he had many affairs. His biggest connection of all was to Leslie, and Leslie said he told her that many times. He had 1 child. True. Referring to a name, the song Amazing Grace. His daughter's name is Grace. I hear Bubby. Well, his name was Bud. The painting Starry Night by Van Gogh. And Leslie says Van Gogh is my favorite artist. We used to go to 2 museums in New York to see this painting and others. She says, I could hardly believe it. Sandra told me that Bud said, you are right, you are right. He then said, poof, proof, something tangible is coming. This was it, a repeat of what he said with Laura, which is what I had asked for. The something tangible coming I interpreted as my book, and I was floored by this. Late in the reading, I asked for the other male who had been present at the beginning. Sandra says Elliot likes to be center stage and takes up all the time, which was true, she said. So the second person steps forward, and he was a brother. His death was unexpected. There was a shock factor, true. It was very fast, 1 minute here, the next gone. No one knows for sure, but the other psychic said the same thing. There were 2 burial services, and that's true. They buried his ashes in 2 separate places. He was distressed or shut out in some way, which is true. I smell alcohol. He or someone else was an alcoholic. Well, he died of alcoholism. And then it came again, like with Bud. She said the word secrets came from my brother, a repeat of what he had said with Laura, which I asked for. He said to me, "Thank you for keeping my secrets." So, interesting. Sandra has like 90% accuracy. The things she said had 90% accuracy. Both saw the different personalities. Both times they said, "You are right, and thanks for keeping my secret." Were the mediums reading her mind and not really contacting the dead? When in England in 2015, she met a medium who dropped by a friend's house and gave her a spontaneous reading. That's interesting. She leaned across and whispered in Leslie's ear. Now, she knew nothing about this other stuff. This is just spontaneously dropping by the house and, "Oh, well, look who's here, my friend Leslie. This is my friend who's a medium." The medium said, "Oh, let me do a reading for you," and leaned over, cupped her hands around her mouth and whispered close to my ear, "You kept my secret." I was shocked. I said, "What?" He says, "I kept his secret?" "Yes, but this was very private and was not for anyone else to hear. The secret was something he was ashamed of. Indeed, it was not for anyone else to hear." So she had 2 more readings, and they weren't as good. She was told by an expert that it's rare to find a medium that's so accurate. There's only about 10% that are as good as this. So chapter 14, Research into Mental Mediumship by Julie Burchell, PhD. She runs the studies at Windbridge Institute in Tucson. They've studied many psychic mediums. They're found to be in good mental health. They're using at the Institute scientific tools to get new knowledge about how mediums work. They wanted something objective. Was this a gift or was it a fraud? So they needed 2 things. They need an optimal environment to study this in, and they need maximum controls to protect it from fraud. The only claim that really is relevant to the study and that needs to be studied is, do mediums convey messages from the dead? The study subjects have to have a recorded track record before being in the study, or she said it's like trying to grow seeds on a table. It's a waste of time. We know seeds grow, but if you throw them on the table, they're not going to grow. And there's no sense in testing mediums who claim to be mediums but don't have a good track record. And then the experimenters have to be objective. The sitter, the client, has to be open-minded and must agree that if their dead loved one could communicate, that they would want to communicate. So, outside of the lab, a good reading depends on a good medium and a good sitter and the dead person. Now, maximum controls. You need to do double blinds. The medium and the sitter must not know anything about each other. And they must have absolutely no way of getting clues, like physical body language and that kind of thing. Also, the researchers have to be blind to all of that too, so they're not unconsciously giving clues. So the sitter doesn't know the medium. The reading is done by telephone. The sitter doesn't hear the reading. It's a research assistant who does all the emailing and gets the name of the dead loved one, and contacts the medium and lets them know that, okay, this client that you've never met, you're not going to talk to, wants to know about Joe or something like that. This prevents cueing from the experimenter and cold readings of the sitter on the part of the medium. The researcher requests specific information about the dead from the medium. It's no good to do general, he wants to tell you I'm okay. That's not enough. The medium does 2 gender-matched readings. So how this works is, what the medium doesn't know is that they're reading like about my brother, then they'll do a separate reading and they'll read about your father. So they're both male contacts. And then you and I get to read the results, but we don't know which one is my brother and which one is your dad. We decide in general which one sounds more like yours, and then specifically why, the particular one sounds like your relative. This eliminates the rater bias. You know it's your reading and you grope for things to find that are right. You're looking for validation. That's eliminated. So the 2 of us score both of the readings that they apply to us. We give an overall score of the reading and we pick which one is ours. And then these are statistically analyzed. In general, only 25% of all statements can be applicable to anybody. So 75% of the time, what the mediums say are so specific. Between 2009 and 2013, they did 58 readings. The sitters, the clients, gave their own reading a significantly higher score and almost always chose their own reading. And this study was a repeat of a study that was done in 2007. So these are repeatable studies and they're getting the same statistical information. The statistically significant, accurate data from a combined total of 74 mediumship readings performed under more than double-blind conditions that eliminated fraud, experimenter cueing, rater bias, and cold reading show that mediums report accurate and specific information about disincarnates without prior knowledge about the disincarnates or the sitters and with no sensory feedback. In other words, certain mediums have unexplainable by current materialistic science abilities to say correct things they should not otherwise know about dead people. We don't know where this information is coming from. You can't, it's a big leap to say, hey, it's from the dead. We know where it's not coming from. It's not body clues. It's not hints. It's not fraud. It's not cold readings. We know all that. In some way, is non-local psi-based phenomena influencing this. So either it's the survival of people who are dead, or there's some sort of psi phenomenon going on between living people, ESP. So this is frustrating for researchers because how to decide which is the source? How do you know? And part of the thing they do is just based on what the medium says. And the medium says a psychic is like reading a book, and a mediumship is like seeing a play. In a mediumship, it feels like someone is talking to me. With psychic readings, it's information about someone. So you get this feeling, God, I think things are not going to be good at the election. That's psychic. I have heard somebody telling me that so-and-so is going to lose. That's mediumship. With psychic information, I have to squint from the inside out to focus on something in the distance. When I do mediumship, it's just received. With mediumship, I get to meet new people all the time. Psychic information is boring. This is a medium speaking. It's different. It's like listening to someone versus looking myself. Okay, let's see here. This one psychic said, there's more of a loving feeling in mediumship. When I connect with somebody on the other side, everyone's happy and great. I feel like I don't know who I am anymore. I lose myself. My identity is gone. I'm part of the universe. I'm part of love energy. Reading psychically is different. I'm more aware of myself. It's more grounded, and it makes me feel alone. So, in a study where mediums were given the name of the dead person and the name of the living person, and not told which one was the dead and which one was the living, they still knew. Mediums reported that the biggest difference in reading with the dead person was that love feeling. They did EEGs, electroencephalographs. They measured brain waves, and they saw differences in the brains and the brain activity when they were communicating as they felt with the dead. So chapter 15, how do they do it? Leslie asked Sandra in Ireland, and she said, I don't know. I've done it since I was 4. I just do it. It's something that's always been a part of me. When she was young, she thought that everyone could do it. And when she was a teenager, she was embarrassed and shut it off. But later, as an adult, people started asking her more and more, and she got reconnected to it. And then she did it for police to help solve cases. More reading... most readings are mundane because that's what the sitter wants. They just want confirmation of who the person is that's being contacted and that they're okay. And the person who's dead just wants us to know that life goes on and everything is fine. Sandra said it's hard to get clear just the facts because of the difficulty of communicating across frequencies. And so often now in this book it's discussed that what we're talking about here is a different dimension that is accessed by a higher vibratory frequency. And this comes out later on too. And the medium is confirming this, that somehow she has to adjust her frequency and the dead person has to be willing to bring theirs down so that they can find a commonality, place to meet. And not everybody can do it. Not everybody living or dead can do it. She says it's a different kind of vibration, and she can tell it's from spirit based on the energies that come in, the information, the sensations they give me. The details of death come in very specifically and really hit me, and I don't think I could psychically tune into that and get the sensations as well. I could not get it that way. I definitely can say it's an external source, absolutely. The brain mapping of psychics and mediums indicates that mediums enter a different state of consciousness than psychics. The doctor was looking at Laura's brain while she was doing psychic readings and then while she was doing her mediumship, and I won't belabor the medical part of it, but they use two different parts of the brain entirely. Chapter 16, called Finding George. Mark Lewis had an experience with a medium. He had always felt the presence of George, his grandfather's youngest brother. This would be his great uncle. He just always felt him around. His grandfather told Mark that Mark looked a lot like George. He just felt a deep affinity to him. And the story was that George died in World War I in France, and his body was never found. And it just made Mark sad. So he had this reading with Sandy, and she immediately said that she was talking to Wall. Well, Wall was his grandfather's nickname. And then she said she saw a guy named George in a uniform with a funny hat. That was George. She said that he was her granddad's favorite brother, and that he was a spiritual father to Mark. That he was gassed. That's how he died. The number 19 was important. She saw a row of crosses. And then she saw the number, G22. And it was 1 of 4. Then she said that he died the same day as Mark's wedding anniversary, July 19th. That's why 19. So Mark... they knew basically where in France, and Mark went on a hunt. And he found until he found a graveyard that had 4 main plots, each one having a place called G22. So Mark met with the medium again, and she turned the map of this graveyard over to the blank side and used a crystal, and it landed on G22, number 3. And she said that George told her that he was buried next to Albert or Alberon. So Mark went and he checked and he found G21 was Albone. So he went to the graveyard in France, and then he went back to a 3rd reading, and the medium immediately came through and said, "You found him." It's an interesting case because no one alive knew anything about where George was or what had happened to him. So it was nobody's psychic impression. Nobody knew. It was completely not known. It could be clairvoyance, but it would have been an extreme path to get there on the part of the medium. So can't 100% dismiss it, but it's unlikely. So chapter 17, Trance, Mediumship, and Drop-In Communicators by Dr. Alan Gould, PhD. Now, I was not that interested in this chapter when I read the title. I've always thought of that whole, table tipping and rapping and sitting in the dark with a trance medium was just a little too theatrical and bizarre for my taste. And I have a pretty open mind about stuff. I'm glad I read it because wait till you hear this stuff. So some mediums can go into a trance, and instead of them reporting what they're hearing from the dead speak directly through them. Usually, the medium connects with one consistent control personality, who comes through every reading and speaks through the medium. This chapter by Gould is from the University of Nottingham, and he studied at Harvard. He's a neuropsychology guy and has won multiple awards for research in parapsychology. He wrote a book that Leslie recommends called Mediumship and Survival. His last name is Gauld. It's Mediumship and Survival. So, trance mediumship is the most advanced form of mediumship. The control takes over the medium's body, and the medium has no memory of any of it. Dead people are the communicators. The controls are the same one, usually every time. And they're the ones who do the talking, and the medium just provides the voice box. Often the medium takes on the body language of the communicator. And they know this because it'll be maybe a distant relative and people remember. So there's some traditional, the history of this is just fraught with con and fraud. And this is why I was so reluctant to get into it. But this is very interesting. Mrs. Piper from 1857 to 1950 in Boston. And she was put through extensive studies. William James, famous William James, the Harvard psychologist, discovered her, and he was interested in all kinds of metaphysical things. She would go into a trance, and while she was in a trance, she felt no pain. They would poke her and burn her, and she wouldn't react, and when she came out of the trance, there'd be no marks. They'd put ammonia under her nose with no effect, but afterwards she'd complain of the after effects. Her control, the ghost who spoke through her, was a Dr. Finuit. All these formal names, Mrs. Piper and Dr. Finuit. So she was taken to England, and while she was there to be studied, she was followed by secret detectives. And they brought in anonymous subjects for her to read on, and they were able to detect no fraud. Then she had a new control suddenly. Dr. Finuit backed off, and she had a control come through called George Pellow. And he had been killed a few weeks before in New York. He had known the studier of mediums, who was a big debunker. His name was Richard Hodgson. He had worked with him. And Hodgson was incredibly accurate. He was able to uncover 30 different frauds, mediums who were fooling people. And this guy's partner died suddenly and managed to come through the medium after debunking all these other mediums, just to let them know she's the real thing and it's true. Sure, there's plenty of fraud, but she's not a fraud, and it's not always a fraud. So the book talks about a couple of cases, and it makes arguments for and against it being non-locality, dead people, or ESP. And basically, it comes to the determination that we don't know. And I thought I'd spare you the details because it's kind of complicated and difficult to summarize. But it talks about a Mrs. Leonard's bookcase. Mrs. Leonard had a control called Fida who came through her. And she was also studied extensively. Now, the book tests, what were they? Mrs. Leonard would go into her trance, and Fida would come through her and say to a specific person, go to your bookshelf, go to the second shelf, find the third book on the second shelf, look at page XYZ, go to page XYZ and look at line number ABC. And on that line, there'll be a word about corgis. And then there would. So how would she know that? It would contain messages, words significant to the person in the room. Maybe the person bred corgis. Maybe it was Queen Elizabeth. I don't know. Sometimes the books would be in a language that Mrs. Leonard didn't speak. For example, once it was classical Greek. So they were never able to prove she was a fraud, and some of the stuff she came up with was pretty interesting. So then there's a test called proxy sitters. This is a way to test, is it ESP? Maybe. So you go to a medium, but you're doing it on the behalf of somebody else, and you have no knowledge of anything that your friend wants to know. You don't know about their private family stuff, and you don't know what it is they want to know. You just go as sort of the receiver of the information. And interestingly, the mediums often come up with stuff. And how did they get access to this information if the the sitter has no knowledge, no way to be connecting with ESP? Then there's this term, drop-in communicators, which was coined by Dr. Ian Stevenson. These are controls that just show up, and they arrive unexpectedly and unknowingly to the medium, and they could be verified after the fact. And this would kind of argue against it being ESP, since the medium had no idea who was talking through her. Usually these souls were just people who really needed to make contact and saw the opportunity. The medium has no previous knowledge of who they are. Nobody does. And they come up with a lot of facts that can be verified, but especially before computers, it was really onerous to verify them. It required going to county records and library archives and obscure museums, and it was kind of an effort. So let's see here. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. In January of 1939, Ludwig Gudmundsson, the owner of a fish factory in the village of Sandgerði, about 36 miles from Reykjavik, Iceland, joined this circle of mediums. The unknown communicator showed great interest in this new sitter. So the medium has some weird communicator coming through her. And that particular night, this guy, the owner of the fish factory, showed up to watch the medium at work. She opens her mouth and there's a new control coming out. And this control showed great interest in the new visitor and eventually said that his missing leg was in this visitor's house at San Gertie. After a good deal of further pressure, the control made this statement. This is what he said. My name is Runolfur Runolfsson, and I was 52 years old when I died. I lived with my wife near San Gertie. I was on a journey in the latter part of the day, and I was drunk. I stopped at the house of Svenbjorn Thordarson in San Gertie and accepted some refreshment there. Refreshment. When I went to go, the weather was so bad they didn't want me to leave unless accompanied by someone. I became angry and said I would not go at all if I could not go alone. My house was only about a 15-minute walk. So I left by myself, but I was wet and I was tired. And he was drunk. And I walked over the pebbles and reached the rocks, and there I sat down and took my bottle and drank some more, and I fell asleep. The tide came in and carried me away. This happened in October of 1879, and I was not found until January of 1880. I was carried in by the tide. But then dogs and ravens came and tore me to pieces. The remnants of my body were found and buried about 4 miles from San Gertie. But then the thigh bone was missing. It was carried out again to sea, but it was later washed up again on the shore, and it was passed around, and it's now in Ludwig's house. Ludwig is this visitor to the circle. The communicator also revealed that he'd been a very tall man. This extraordinary tale was subsequently verified in considerable detail. Ludwig knew nothing about the thigh bone in his house, but after inquiries among older local inhabitants, he found that sometime in the 20s, such a bone, believed to have been washed up by shore, by the sea, had been placed in an interior wall. It was recovered and turned out to be the femur of a very tall man. No one knew whose bone it was, and there was no record that indicated whether or not the thigh bone was missing from Runcke's remains. One wonders indeed why, even if the deceased Runcke were the source of the communication, and even if the thigh bone were actually his, he should have had any special knowledge of the fact that his bone was in the wall. That's so weird. Okay, just a little story. Chapter 18, Seeking the White Crow. Drop-in communication, which are spirits who just show up at mediums' readings, are especially evidential because no one's been able to prepare for them and nobody has that ESP knowledge floating around in their brain. Gaude is an experienced, meticulous, and objective investigator with decades of experience, and he tends to err on the side of caution. So when a spirit is proven to have lived, and many facts that are really obscure can be verified, this whole situation is an argument for the survival theory. It only takes one white crow to prove that not all crows are black. These drop-ins show up for their own reasons and not to serve the people that are in the room gathered together. The people in the room usually don't have any clue who they are at all. So this is not a situation where the drop-ins are a manufactured thing to fraud. So if it was ESP, it would have to include many obscure personal facts that were unrecorded, unknown, and hard to find, but verifiable after much research. I mean, it becomes quite the chore. Brain scans do verify differing states of consciousness that these trance mediums have. They document that they do use a different part of their brain, and we don't yet know what's going on in the brain, but it can be measured and repeated with consistent results. Data seem to point to the same reality. Somehow, consciousness connects to something outside, independent of the brain. Can the dead communicate without a medium? Direct contact? Here we go with some really interesting stuff here. This is just totally a mind blower. Chapter 19, After Death Communication, ADC. Signals from the dead loved one with clear, meaningful messages, usually unasked for, usually shocking people, and they can come as the result of a request, but sometimes just out of the blue. Now, a lot of this is not evidential, it's anecdotal, and it can be most life-changing because it often is profoundly personal and specific. Often happens to people when they're in grief, and so is this unconsciously self-generated? We don't know. Are these manifestations of psi phenomena? However, some involve multiple recipients and unusual physical phenomena, which makes you wonder. So, what are we talking about? We're talking about after-death experiences that happen, communications that happen in a variety of ways. Visits in people's dreams, forms and apparitions that they actually see in the room, electrical effects on TVs, computers, lights, electronics, watches, the movement or relocation of objects, or the inexplicable appearance of meaningful objects. The disappearance and reappearance of objects. I've had that happen to me. Lights coming with no source, just a light, and there's no lamp or candle. Audible voices and sound, smells, touch, or just the strong sense of a presence. So Martin Carden, who died in 1997, had written more than 50 books, including a book called Cyborg, from which they made the movie, The $6 Million Man. He was an authority on aviation. He was a pilot. He had the ability of psychokinesis. He could make things move with his mind. Now, this is, a lot of this stuff is still laughed off by the general public, but it's been proven in repeatable experiments to occur. So, in his case, it has. He was very interested in the paranormal, obviously. So 9 days after his death, his best friend, parapsychologist Lloyd Auerbach, was on the LA freeway listening to the radio. Done that myself a couple of times. And suddenly sensed a presence in his car. And suddenly the car filled up with the smell of cigar smoke. And he recognized the smell of Martin's cigar. Was Martin saying goodbye? Lloyd went home and called a mutual friend of his and Martin's. And the friend said, "Oh, I can't believe you're calling me. Don't tell me anything. Wait a minute. You got to hear what I have to say. This morning at 10, the same time that Lloyd smelled the cigar smoke in the car. This morning at 10, I was flying my airplane and the cockpit filled with the smell of cigar smoke." A third friend, also a pilot, had the same experience. All three are rational, competent people. All three had strongly felt that it was a visitation. Excuse me. Allergies, it's okay. Not COVID. Allergies. This time of year, the wind, it's that wind. Oh my God, it's terrible. If this came from psi phenomena, if this was created by their own psychic ability, why is it that it happens to 3 different people in 3 different places, unbeknownst to each other, at exactly the same time by clock? Far apart, not in contact, at the same moment. In 2002, psychiatrist Elizabeth Tark, MD, who was a researcher, got a $1.5 million research grant from the National Institute of Health to study glioblastoma multiforme. This is a rare brain tumor. And her study was on its response to distance praying for healing. National Institute of Health. Not only was she a researcher, a doctor, she was a certified Russian translator. She was fluent in Russian. So 2 months after she began this research study about prayer, healing brain tumors for the National Institute of Health, that blows my mind, she developed a glioblastoma. Very rare. She died near Stanford, where she worked, at the age of 40. Her father was Russell Tark. He was a pioneer inventor of the laser. He had co-authored 2 books with Dr. Jane Katra of the University of Oregon Public Health, books on non-local consciousness and healing. Jane did not believe in communication with the dead. So she was absolutely 100% a skeptic. So, what have we got here to tell you? And this is what Jane says. I have been the recipient of or witness to over 30 surprising and spontaneous communications from Elizabeth after her death. The most evidential ones were those received by more than one person at the same time. A communication in a foreign language unknown to the recipient, lights flashing on and off, or books about healing moving themselves off shelves when people talked about her, messages to 2 people regarding serious health problems unknown to either of them, and a prediction wherein several people received different incomplete communication, and when we put them together, they completed an idea. One of the more striking examples occurred only a few days after the memorial service for Elizabeth. Elizabeth's husband received a letter from Kate, a close friend of Elizabeth's who lived in Washington State. Kate said that she had had a dream in which Elizabeth asked her to give him, the husband, a message. She said Elizabeth began chanting nonsense syllables to her over and over, first in the dream, but so persistently that Kate was awakened from a sound sleep. She continued to hear the syllables, so she got up and wrote them down as if she was taking dictation. Kate had no idea what they meant or how they were spelled, but they were repeated so many times she was able to transcribe them phonetically. To her, they were simply odd sounds. She wrote, Yati ba vishu, Yati ba lu blue, Yadi yes, Yadi yes. So since she was told the message was the message was for Elizabeth's husband, Kate mailed it to him. He brought out the letter when he was eating lunch together with Jane, the doubting Thomas, and Russell Tark, Elizabeth's dad, and suggested that Jane read it aloud for all to hear. After Jane had read the sequence of nonsense syllables out loud a few times, Russell exclaimed, "Wait a minute! Those words aren't nonsense, they're Russian. And translated, they mean, I see you, I love you, I'm here, I'm here." And then they actually write it in Russian for you, in case you can read it. Kate verified she'd never spoken any Russian, never been to Russia, never heard people speaking Russian. A specific after-death message in a foreign language had been delivered through a third person who did not understand a word of it. I wanted to make my mark in the world by being intelligent, Jane says. Science and good research were my framework. We didn't do religion. I did not believe in survival of consciousness after death or in after-death communication. I certainly did not believe that they happened to people like me. But eventually it became clear to me and many others that these communications were indeed coming from Elizabeth Tark. I no longer had any doubt. Okay, there was a survey done at the University of Iceland in the mid-70s of 902 people. 31% said yes, they were contacted by deceased family. In 1980 in Western Europe, 25% said yes, and in the US, 31%. But belief does not make it so. It's very important to remember, 80% of the people believe what's in the Bible. That's nothing. That doesn't mean anything. It's uncommon, but it's not nothing that you would do okay, how does she put this? It's uncommon that you would do one of these surveys, because if you were a liar, because the surveys are lengthy questionnaires. Nobody wants to be bothered. It would be very unusual for a person out of the blue contacted with, will you fill in the survey, would bother to perpetuate a fraud out of the blue like that. It just seems odd. So interestingly enough, some of these cases involve multiple witnesses, like the airline guys with the cigar smoke. And as in this case with the Russians, some were messages sent through a third person who was a stranger. You just can't scientifically reject all of them. Some of them, yes, but not all of them. Usually between a half to a full year after the death is when they happen, and usually 3/4 of them happen about before the 4-year mark. And this is when the emotional tie is still the strongest. 86% that happen in the first 24 hours happen to people who don't even know the dead person is dead or dying. That's weird. In cases happening within an hour of death, 89%, now those are two different numbers, 86 and 89. They must be from two separate studies. I didn't know the person was dying. Yeah, the Iceland study said 28% of these deaths are sudden, unexpected, or violent. And this corresponds, so I guess they're comparing studies. This corresponds to the data of Dr. Jim Tucker with the kids with the past life memories, the violent deaths, roughly the same percentage. There's a higher number of males that this involves, but then males are statistically more likely to die in a violent death, 72%. Isn't that interesting? And apparitions occur more often in cases of violent death. Persons suffering a violent death feature predominantly in cases of apparitions of the dead and in cases of the reincarnation type, as well as in mediumship, including both direct communicators and drop-ins. The cases tend to have an invasive character, in that the deceased persons are frequently unknown to those who experience them and thus seem to assume an active role in their appearance. All of these findings tend, in my view, to defend and support the survival hypotheses. Karen, who I don't remember, but I'm supposed to remember here apparently. Kean. God, it would help if I could read my own handwriting. Kean experienced some weird things while researching the book between 2013 and 2015. And I'm going to go ahead and read this to you because it's really interesting. Her first after-death experience came out of the blue, before any mediumship readings or before I entertained even the slightest thought of any such communication. I was lying on my bed alone in deep mourning with the overwhelming pain of my brother being gone forever. Suddenly his voice burst onto the scene. It startled me because I experienced it not as generated from my brain. It was on the outside in the room. I heard his familiar voice clearly say, "Leslie, I'm fine. It's okay." The way he said my name was unique to the way he spoke. It was so clearly his tone. His emphasis was, "Hey, stop. Everything's totally okay and I'm fine." I was stunned because it was like a sudden and jolting external intrusion, completely different from a thought or a memory. This seemed like an experience of telepathy. I felt like I was hearing with my mind and not my ears. It wasn't in my mind, but it was perceived by my mind as if my consciousness had its own non-physical ears. It had sound, it was loud, but not quite like someone talking because it wasn't localized to one spot. I was completely taken aback. There were other experiences such as a dream visit and electrical disturbances, lights going on and off by themselves, that seemed strange, but I had no idea if they meant anything. But then I had my reading with Laura, and she told me that my brother had been throwing his energy. He's working hard to communicate through electrical things. He's already done something. A light went off and on. This was uncanny. The night I returned from Gary's memorial service in Scotland, I was falling asleep and suddenly the light went on by my bed by itself and stayed on. I remember feeling like it was him, but who knows? It was a nice thought, but I didn't make much of it. Laura, the medium, says, with the refrigerator too, and he's laughing. I didn't know what this meant during the reading. It made no sense to me at all. Something amusing involving an attempt to communicate using a refrigerator. But when I listened to the recording afterwards, suddenly it hit me. A couple of months earlier, my refrigerator had built up solid ice along the inside back wall. For a few days, I melted it off with matches, that sounds safe, and kept resetting the temperature, raising it up to warm the inside, but for some reason that didn't solve the problem. So finally, I got the repair company, which sent 2 technicians over. They took one look and showed me that a simple button located on the outside and above the door controlled the internal fan, but had been turned off. I couldn't understand how this had happened because I knew for sure I had not touched this button, and there had been no one else in my apartment that could have done so. I felt silly. The repairman apologized for having to charge me $100 for simply pressing the button. It was ridiculous, and Laura said my brother was laughing. Could he have been playing a prank on me, or did he try to do something else with the refrigerator and it went awry? So this was mechanical. So was this like telekinesis? Was this psychological? Psychic? Was this not a communication from the dead, but some weird energy effect of the medium? So she was staying at a home with her family in the summer house in the woods on the coast of Massachusetts, and was hoping for some more proof. She describes this experience of red balloons, and I'm not going to go into this, but she said, give me some sort of sign that you're really around. And she decided, okay, just randomly, a red balloon, and all of a sudden red balloons were stuck in trees and red balloons were on the water, and it was just really weird. And she felt that that was an answer to her request as some sort of a sign. She asked again. And the next day she was cooking, and she was using sesame oil, and she twisted the top and shut it. It's just a little bottle of sesame oil, nothing exciting. And while she was standing there, the lid shot up into the air really high and made a pop. And she thought, oh, come on. And she said out loud, if that was you, do it again. And the next day it happened again. Never happened before or since. But is this psychokinesis? Is this basically a result of her extreme desire to contact her brother? Is the intensity in her longing what's making this stuff happen? Yeah, and then she just talks more about seeing more balloons. I'm not going to belabor the point. So Leslie sought out experiences that were credible and more evidential. Jeff Kean, an academic vice president of a university and a PhD, is the oldest. Had an oldest son, Gabriel, who died in a car crash 4 days before his 22nd birthday. Is so sad. Jeff wrote a book of poetry about his grief, and it's so sad. On Gabriel's birthday, 4 days after his death, he and his wife heard a crash upstairs. And they went up. In the closet, they found that a shelf had fallen, and everything on it was on the floor. And there was just this pile, big mess of shoes and boxes and clothes, and oh God, it's a nightmare. But at the very top of the pile, in the center, face up, was the album of Gabriel's birth. It hadn't been touched in 7 years. Jeff thought, either this is cruel fate or this is something meaningful. So his wife Janet went to a medium and was told that Gabriel would leave dimes to show that he was around. Jeff told her this is nonsense. He felt like the medium had set them up for confirmation bias, that they would start looking for the self-fulfilling prophecy. 2 days later, his wife was swimming in the ocean, and a dime floated into her open hand. And 2 days later after that, Jeff was asleep, and he woke up suddenly, and in the moonlight, he saw what looked like a dime on the floor, and he thought, oh, sure. I wonder if that's a sign from Gabriel. And he heard a voice that said, check the date. And so he got up and he looked, and it was a dime, and it said 1981, which was the date of Gabriel's birth. Months later, they were driving to the national park, and they were wishing, that he could be with them. And the car clock right in front of their eyes jumped an hour ahead. And there was no explanation. And they're discussing this. And in the car the next day, he said to his wife, this was a fluke. We must have passed a cell phone tower or something like that. He says to her, I'd take it a whole lot more seriously if the clock jumped 2 hours. And at that moment, the clock jumped 2 hours. Never did that before or after. And it's actually a common occurrence for there to be weird anomalous effects on electrical appliances. Jeff was home sick in bed, and he felt like he felt his son's presence. And he actually said out loud, Gabriel, if that's you, give me a sign. And all the lights went out. But then they all came back in. And he found out there was no power outage anywhere. He kept feeling he was receiving thoughts from Gabriel. And he was worried he was losing his mind. And he asked Gabriel, tell me something I can't possibly know that makes no sense to me, but that I can validate. And he heard, I am red. He thought, oh my God, I'm losing my mind. So he laughed. He thought this was absolutely absurd. And he dismissed it. And for several weeks, he just decided that he was getting kind of crazy with grief. One day, he says, these thoughts, they're just me speaking. It's not validation. I have to be making this up. I must just be going crazy. An hour later, a package arrived. And in the package was a painting of an angel. And the angel in the painting looked like their son Gabriel. And it was all in red. And the note that came with it said it was a gift from the mother of one of his wife's students. That she was in the store, she was walking past the store and saw this red angel and felt absolutely compelled to buy it. And she didn't know why, and she knew she was going to give it to them, and she didn't know why. And it included a card by the painter. And the card said that the magenta color was the closest light in the spectrum emitted by those who die in their youth. It's the color of communication and love from the dead to the living. So the wife got a message from the son Gabriel through the medium saying, take care. And this made her very nervous because she had had breast cancer. And Jeff got mad because the wife was really, really very worried. And he told Gabriel, knock it off. I want to know how your mom is. He tried to go to sleep. And then he got a phone call out of the blue while he was trying to sleep. And on the line was a friend of his who was a clairvoyant, somebody he hadn't spoken to in 6 months. And she said, Jeff, I was on the phone with my mother right now, and I heard Gabriel yelling at me, the dead son. He said, "Hang up. My father needs to speak with me. Hang up and call him now." He was so persistent, I had to get off and call you. What's going on? She was able to talk with Gabriel and communicate to Jeff that Janet was fine and there was nothing to worry about. One day he saw a ball of light hovering in Gabriel's room. And months later, the medium told him, that was Gabriel. You saw that ball of light, that was Gabriel. He meditated, and Gabriel told him the light is in all of our souls. Jeffrey says there'll never be proof. There'll never be proof that would mean proof to him. Either the communication is coming from surviving consciousness or it's coming from internal unconscious forces that we don't understand, and right now we're just not equipped to understand it. So all we can do is just appreciate that it happens. So that's the end of part 3, and I'll be back soon. Thanks.